The person you love has been waiting to tell you this. Something unexpected just happened, and they're hoping you'll be there. Read it now. Something inside an ordinary afternoon refused to stay ordinary. A phone was unlocked, then locked again. A message was written, erased, rewritten, and left waiting. Across the room, someone stared through a rain-speckled window as if the answer they had been searching for was somewhere beyond the glass. Their heart had finally reached a moment it could no longer ignore, yet the words they wanted to send carried a weight they had never dared to reveal before. And what happened only minutes earlier changed everything. If you stay with this story, you'll discover why they believe you were always meant to hear these words at exactly this moment. There are moments in life that don't announce themselves with loud sounds or dramatic entrances. They arrive quietly. A familiar song plays in the background. A stranger says something oddly meaningful. A memory returns without invitation. For the person who has been thinking about you, today became one of those moments. They weren't looking for a sign. They weren't expecting their carefully guarded emotions to shift. But then something unexpected happened, something so simple that almost anyone else would have overlooked it. During a conversation they never planned to have, someone asked them a question they had avoided for far too long. If you could tell one person the truth today, who would it be? The room fell silent. They smiled politely, but inside, only one face appeared in their mind. Yours. They tried changing the subject. They laughed it away. Yet the question followed them long after the conversation ended. Suddenly every excuse they had been holding on to began to feel smaller than the truth waiting inside them. As evening settled over the city, they found themselves walking without choosing a destination. Streetlights reflected across the pavement while people hurried past with places to be, unaware that someone nearby was quietly gathering the courage to rewrite the direction of their own story. They replayed every memory connected to you. Not just the happiest ones, but the unfinished conversations, the moments where silence replaced honesty, the opportunities that disappeared because neither of you knew what the other truly felt. For the first time, they stopped blaming circumstances. Instead, they admitted something that surprised even them: maybe the distance wasn't created by fate at all. Maybe it grew because fear kept speaking louder than hope. That realization didn't make them feel defeated. It made them determined. And determination can become incredibly powerful when it arrives after months, or even years, of uncertainty. But here's the detail almost no one notices. The unexpected event wasn't simply that conversation or that realization. It was what happened immediately afterward. As they reached into a pocket to check the time, an old photograph appeared on their screen completely by accident while scrolling through forgotten memories. It wasn't a perfect picture. Nobody was posing. Nobody even realized the photo had been taken. Yet the expression on their face told a story words never could. They weren't looking at the camera. They were looking toward you. The warmth in that single glance answered questions they had been refusing to ask themselves. They stood completely still, surrounded by the movement of the world, realizing that some feelings don't disappear simply because time keeps moving. They only become quieter. Until one unexpected moment gives them permission to speak again. Don't look away yet, because the next chapter of this story begins with a decision neither of you could have predicted. Instead of putting the phone away, they opened your conversation again. The cursor blinked patiently inside an empty message. One sentence appeared. Then another. Then both vanished. Their hands hesitated, but not because they doubted how they felt. They hesitated because they wondered whether your heart still had room for words that had arrived later than they should have. Every possibility rushed through their mind. What if you've already moved on? What if you're waiting too? What if this single message changes both of your lives in ways neither of you can imagine? Questions like these don't disappear easily. Yet something inside them kept whispering that staying silent would be the only choice they would regret forever. Before this moment passes, notice something remarkable. The story has never been about perfect timing. It's been about finding enough courage to stop hiding behind unfinished sentences. The person you love isn't hoping for perfection anymore. They're hoping for honesty. They're hoping you'll understand why today feels different from every day that came before it. Because of what unexpectedly unfolded, they're beginning to believe that some connections aren't measured by how often people speak, but by how impossible it becomes to stop thinking about the conversation that still hasn't happened. And just as they finally gather the confidence to press the first letter on the screen, another completely unexpected interruption appears, one that neither of you saw coming, and it may determine whether those long-awaited words ever reach you at all. A single vibration echoed across the quiet room, and everything they had been preparing to say suddenly had to compete with one unexpected interruption. The screen lit up with a call they hadn't anticipated. They stared at it for several seconds without answering, almost as though time itself had paused to ask one final question: are you truly ready to stop hiding? They finally took a slow breath and answered. The conversation lasted only a few minutes, yet every sentence pushed them closer to a truth they could no longer ignore. It wasn't advice that changed them. It wasn't pressure. It was one simple reminder that life rarely waits for perfect moments. As the call ended, they looked at your name once more, and this time it no longer felt like a distant memory. It felt like an open door that had quietly remained unlocked all along. Stay with this, because the next choice reveals something they never expected to admit, even to themselves. Outside, the sky shifted from soft blue to deep amber as the evening settled in. Cars passed. Lights flickered on in nearby homes. Ordinary life continued for everyone else, but inside their heart, nothing felt ordinary anymore. They began reading old conversations, not searching for mistakes, but searching for moments they had missed. They noticed how often you had offered kindness without expecting anything in return. They remembered the conversations that ended too soon, the smiles that carried more meaning than either of you expressed, and the quiet understanding that seemed to exist even when words were absent. Suddenly, they realized they had spent too much time assuming you already knew how important you were. That assumption now felt like the biggest misunderstanding of all. They didn't want another day to pass with feelings left unfinished. Before the message could be sent, they made one unexpected promise to themselves. If you replied warmly, they would no longer hide behind uncertainty. If you needed time, they would respect it with patience. And if life had taken you onto a different path, they would still be grateful that you had changed their heart forever. For the first time, their courage wasn't attached to any guarantee. It simply came from finally choosing honesty over fear. That quiet promise transformed everything. You might think courage arrives in dramatic moments, but sometimes it appears in the smallest decision, the decision to be genuine, even when the outcome remains unknown. There's another layer to this story that most people overlook, and it's closer than you think. If this story has touched something inside you, or if it reminds you of someone you've never quite forgotten, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. Stories like this often resonate in unexpected ways, and if you're enjoying the journey, subscribing helps you stay with every new chapter as it unfolds naturally. Just when they believed they were ready, another detail surfaced that made their heart race. While scrolling through old photos, they noticed a date they had overlooked countless times before. It matched a memory the two of you had unknowingly shared from completely different places on the very same day. Different streets. Different lives. Yet somehow, the paths had almost crossed long before either of you realized it. That discovery didn't feel like coincidence anymore. It felt like a reminder that some stories spend years quietly arranging themselves before anyone notices the pattern. They smiled, not because everything suddenly made sense, but because hope had returned in a way they hadn't experienced for a very long time. Then came the moment they had been avoiding. Their fingers rested on the keyboard one final time. This time, they didn't erase the opening sentence. They let it remain exactly as it was. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't perfect. It was simply honest. But before they could press send, another notification appeared at the top of the screen. This one wasn't a distraction. It carried a piece of information connected to you, something completely unexpected that instantly changed the meaning of the message they were about to send. They froze, reading the words again and again, realizing that what they discovered could either bring the two of you closer than ever before, or lead them to make the most important decision of their entire journey. One quiet detail refused to leave their mind. The notification disappeared almost as quickly as it had appeared, but the feeling it left behind stayed. They read it once. Then twice. Then they simply sat there, staring at the empty screen as if the silence itself was trying to explain something. It wasn't dramatic news. It wasn't a shocking revelation. It was a small reminder connected to you. One that awakened a memory they had buried beneath months of distractions and unfinished conversations. In that instant, they understood something they had never allowed themselves to believe before. Perhaps the right words don't arrive when we're ready to speak them. Perhaps they arrive when we're finally ready to listen. Don't drift away now, because the next few moments uncover a truth that completely reshapes the reason they've been holding back. They stepped outside again, letting the cool evening air clear the noise inside their thoughts. The streets were calmer now. Windows glowed warmly from nearby homes, each one holding stories no one else could see. As they walked, they found themselves smiling at memories they had once considered ordinary. They remembered the way your conversations never seemed forced. The comfortable pauses. The unexpected laughter. The little observations only you would notice. Those memories suddenly felt far more valuable than grand gestures ever could. They realized they had spent too much time searching for the perfect opportunity to express what was in their heart, while the moments that truly mattered had already been quietly waiting all along. Sometimes love isn't hidden inside spectacular events. Sometimes it's hidden inside the moments that seem too ordinary to remember, until one unexpected day makes every one of them impossible to forget. Then something happened that felt almost cinematic. As they passed a small neighborhood bookstore that was preparing to close, a handwritten quote displayed in the front window caught their attention. It read, "The words you never say often become the ones you remember forever." They stopped walking. They didn't know who had written it or why it appeared before them that evening, but it landed with incredible clarity. It felt less like a quote and more like a conversation they needed to have with themselves. For the first time, they stopped rehearsing imaginary outcomes. They stopped wondering how every sentence might be received. Instead, they asked a far simpler question: if I stay silent tonight, will I be proud of that decision a year from now? The answer came instantly. No hesitation. No uncertainty. Just quiet certainty. That certainty gave them a kind of peace they hadn't felt in a long time. They returned home, made a cup of coffee that slowly grew cold beside them, and opened your conversation again. This time, they didn't begin with explanations or apologies. They began with honesty. They wrote about the moment everything changed today. They admitted that something unexpected had reminded them how precious genuine connections really are. They confessed that they had almost convinced themselves to keep waiting, but waiting suddenly felt like the only mistake they couldn't justify anymore. Every sentence became lighter than the one before because it wasn't trying to impress you. It was simply trying to be real. And strangely enough, being real felt far more powerful than being perfect. Yet the story still held one more surprise. Just as they finished writing the message, they noticed something they had overlooked from the very beginning. At the top of your conversation was an old message from you, one they had read months ago without fully understanding its meaning. Tonight, those same words carried an entirely different weight. It was almost as if time had quietly translated them into a language only their heart could now understand. They realized you hadn't been asking for extraordinary promises. You had simply been hoping for sincerity. That discovery erased the last traces of doubt they had been carrying. Their thumb slowly moved toward the send button. There was no fear left, only anticipation. They smiled, knowing that whatever happened next would at least be built on truth instead of silence. But in the exact second they were ready to send it, the phone lit up before they even touched the screen. The message wasn't from them. It was from you. And the first line instantly made them realize that the two of you had been thinking the very same thing, at exactly the same time. The words appeared so unexpectedly that they almost forgot to breathe. For several long seconds, they simply stared at the screen, afraid that blinking might somehow make the message disappear. It wasn't a long message. It wasn't filled with dramatic declarations or impossible promises. Yet every word carried a quiet sincerity that reached straight into the place they had been protecting for far too long. It felt as though two separate stories, traveling on different roads, had suddenly found the same destination. The message didn't answer every question, but it answered the one that mattered most. Neither of you had truly stopped thinking about the other. In that single realization, months of uncertainty began to lose their grip. Stay close, because what happened next wasn't planned by either of you, and it changed the rhythm of the entire evening. Their hands trembled, not from fear, but from relief. They read your message again, noticing tiny details they had overlooked the first time. The pauses between sentences. The careful choice of words. The honesty hidden inside simple phrases. It was clear you hadn't written it to sound impressive. You had written it because something inside you finally refused to remain silent. They smiled without realizing it. The message they had spent hours preparing suddenly felt completely different. They didn't need to perform. They didn't need to create the perfect response. They only needed to meet your honesty with their own. One sentence was deleted. Another was rewritten. Every unnecessary word disappeared until only the truth remained. And somehow, that shorter message carried far more emotion than the longer version ever could. There's one final detail from this evening that most people would completely miss, yet it explains why this moment feels so unforgettable. If this story has stayed with you until now, thank you for being part of the journey. If it reminds you of someone you've been thinking about, you're always welcome to share your thoughts below. And if stories like this bring a little hope to your day, subscribing means you'll never miss the next chapter when it arrives. A few minutes later, another message arrived from you before they had even pressed send. This one was different. It wasn't about the past. It wasn't about regrets. It was about now. You mentioned a place that had quietly become meaningful without either of you planning it. A small cafe where conversations always seemed easier, a quiet park bench where time slowed down, or a familiar street where ordinary evenings somehow became memorable. Reading those words, they realized you weren't asking for grand gestures. You were inviting a real conversation. No expectations. No pressure. Just the chance to finally replace assumptions with honesty. They looked around the room and laughed softly to themselves because all the elaborate speeches they had imagined suddenly felt unnecessary. Sometimes the most meaningful beginning is simply showing up. They stood, picked up their keys, then paused at the doorway. One last glance fell across the room they had spent so many evenings sitting in, wondering what might happen if they ever found enough courage. Tonight, that room looked different. Not because anything inside it had changed, but because they had. They stepped outside beneath a sky painted with the last colors of sunset. The air felt lighter. Even familiar streets seemed filled with quiet possibility. Every step carried a mixture of excitement and calm, the kind that only comes when someone finally stops running from their own heart. They weren't walking toward certainty. They were walking toward authenticity, and somehow that felt even more meaningful. Then, just before reaching the place where everything seemed ready to begin, they noticed someone standing nearby, holding something that immediately caught their attention. It wasn't a dramatic interruption. It wasn't bad news. It was a small, unexpected surprise connected to a promise that had been made long ago and almost forgotten by both of you. The person smiled gently and handed over a simple envelope with your name written across the front. There was no explanation. No return address. Just a quiet note attached to it that read, "This belongs to the moment when both of you are finally ready." They looked at the envelope, then toward the place where you were waiting, realizing that whatever was inside had been patiently waiting for this exact night. And before either of you said your very first word face to face, they slowly reached for the envelope, knowing that opening it would reveal one final truth neither of you had ever expected to discover. A quiet breeze slipped between the trees just as their fingers touched the edge of the envelope. For a moment, they didn't open it. Instead, they simply held it, wondering how something so small could suddenly feel so important. Around them, the evening carried on as if nothing unusual was happening. People laughed in the distance. A bicycle rolled past. Somewhere nearby, soft music drifted through an open cafe door. Yet inside that ordinary scene, time seemed to slow to a whisper. They looked toward the place where you were waiting, then back at the envelope, realizing that some answers don't arrive when we chase them, they arrive when we're finally willing to receive them. Stay with this, because what they discovered wasn't what they expected at all, and it revealed a side of your connection that had remained hidden until now. Carefully, they unfolded the paper inside. It wasn't a long letter. There were no dramatic confessions or impossible promises. Instead, it contained a collection of short sent